It's preparing. All right, here we go. Now we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. We're doing this Zoom thing from coronavirus lockdown. But today I am very happy to say that I have a guest author on. The Vida Cruz is joining us today. I'm so glad you could join us, and we're at a little bit of a special time because Vida is joining us from all the way from the Philippines. So that is super cool. We are global, which I love. So yay. Anyway, I'm happy to have you here. We're going to start by talking about your story, which is called In the Shadow of the Typhoon, Humans in Mahiwaga Cooperate for Survival. When did this come out?
In December of last year.
Okay. And it was on a long list for the British Science Fiction Fantasy Awards. Am I right?
Yeah, that was amazing. Also,
That's amazing.
It was in an anthology edited by our good friend Marian Womack.
Oh, great. So congratulations on the story, first of all. This is a really fun story and a really great gateway for talking about world building. It has so many layers, okay? So it's written as a newspaper article. So clearly the title of the story is the title of the newspaper article. And it's written as though a reporter had an opportunity to go, sort of like a personal interest story. Like, I don't know, you have this opportunity to go around with somebody and chronicle their efforts in their day. And it's part of a larger news story because it's in the aftermath of Typhoon Yolanda. And it's just really, really cool. Now, this is not the first story that you and I have spoken about, Vida, that has had this format. Do you write a great number of stories in this format?
Yeah, I think I have 4 or 5 in this format already. Mm-hmm. This series is actually what I presented to the Tiptree committee when I was applying for a grant 2 years ago.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah. I have one in this format coming out on May 4 on Strange Horizons. That one is cool. That one is about a magical cafe, and it's kind of a food review, but it's also kind of talking about dictatorship.
I love that. That's awesome. So let me ask you, when did this series become a concept in your mind?
I wrote the first story in the series back in 2013. I came from a writer's workshop, and I really didn't like that workshop because the panelists weren't really giving feedback that could help. And then they also said some, for me, they were offensive things like, why can't you write about poverty from your gated community, that sort of thing. And that made me really, really angry. And so the first story I wrote was a review, not really a review. It was talking about the opening night of a play that kind of skewers critics who are along the lines of the person who said that to me. Mm-hmm. And then I can't remember when I wrote the second story, but then I realized that this was a really good vehicle to talk about contemporary issues.
Yeah.
That I feel passionate about. I remember now. The second story I wrote was the cafe story, and it was in the same year that Duterte won the 2016 elections. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was feeling really terrible in those first few months. So I wanted to talk about how I can't believe that all these people, some of them whom I know, have no compassion for the people who are victims of extrajudicial killings.
Mm,
So the
yeah.
second story is about Diwata, who's kind of like our mountain goddess here. Um, she opens up a cafe that extracts heartbreak from people as the main ingredient of her food, which makes it really delicious. But then when you eat the food, you are given the memories of the people the heartbreak came from. And the people she happens to get them from are the family members of the EJK victims and also martial law victims.
Wow.
And that's my story coming out on Strange Horizons next month.
Wow. That sounds amazing. So this is a world that combines modern current events and sort of our modern world with a sort of existing mythological layer where Dewata and other creatures of mythology are just sort of not unremarkably living alongside modern humans and acting on their own motives and all this kind of stuff. Was it, let's see, you said that when you wrote the first story, uh, you were, was it like, was it always destined to be modern times in this world?
Yeah. And also, how do I put this? Here in the Philippines, we pretty much live with mythology right from our childhoods because a lot of us are raised by people who still believe in the superstitions. So, for example, when you want a kid to go to bed and they won't go to bed, you scare them with,
Mm.
you have to go to bed because the aswang will eat you or something like that. Or like I read about the story. There was this graduation on the campus
Uh-huh.
where
Okay.
this campus in Laguna, and it's situated among the mountains of Mount Makiling, which is the name of the diwata that I put in the story that I gave you. During
Yeah.
the graduation, suddenly all there was this rain of leaves and petals, and then like one of the school administrators said, "I think the diwata approves." During the
Okay.
graduation. So yeah, it's a normal thing for us.
So
And
it's yeah, okay.
I wanted to bring that feeling into a story.
That's really cool. So I did lose your audio for a little while, but I think I got the gist. It's okay. If I somehow missed something, that will probably become evident. Um, that's okay. Okay, so there's a sort of general vibe of inclusion of these stories and references and everything that's sort of ongoing in modern cultures. That am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
Very cool. Um, awesome. So yeah, this seems like a when we talked yesterday, you said that one of the things that you could talk about was, you know, uh, using mythology in science fiction. Do you consider this an example of that?
Well, this story isn't necessarily science fiction, but then hmm, how do I put it? I know it can be done. I'm still working on something that does utilize mythology and and then combines it with science fiction. And I
Mhm,
don't think it necessarily has to be like, I don't know, maybe monsters in space or something.
mhm,
It you can also borrow the structure of a myth and pattern your story after that. Or like,
mhm.
oh my gosh, hi David. Okay. And then you can also, because like the way I see myths, I yes, Tower of Babel sci-fi. You can that's one way of doing it. You can retell myths
Mhm.
in a scientific perspective, or like the way I see them, because mythological characters are larger than life, so
Yeah.
they represent like a value or an emotion, and then you can transplant them into a sci-fi story and then have them and really have a metaphor going, like for example, good versus evil, or um, I don't know, communism versus capitalism, stuff like that.
Mhm. That's great. I was just wondering if there was a link between the story and the way you had thought about that. But I think there part of it is just there's this really interesting juxtaposition. I also like that you're very aware of how should I put this? You're very aware of the format, like the style of story that you're telling is one of the variables that you are working with, right? You're not
Yeah.
just sort of diving in and saying, I'm telling a story of a particular type, but you're saying, actually, this is a newspaper article.
Yeah.
And so it's going to have the format and tone of a newspaper article.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention at the time I wrote the first story, I was actually working as a journalist.
Oh,
So
cool.
yeah, that really influenced the way I write stories until now, even the ones that aren't news article format.
Interesting. So are you no longer working as a journalist at this time?
No, but I feel like I'm gonna get an anxiety attack if I go back into media at this point. But I do freelance, like, fluffy travel lifestyle pieces from time to time.
Okay. Okay, cool. Let's see. Um, as far as what we should talk about next, I feel like there's so many things. We have so many things we could talk about. One possibility would be to delve into some of the specific parts of the story that you find the most enjoyable or important. Is that a good place to go at this point?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So, so the journalist is traveling around with one of the Marias, right?
Yeah.
In a golden boat, which is really awesome. and delivering food and medical supplies and various things to people who've been affected by the hurricane or the typhoon, right? It's a typhoon.
They're the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what was it that made the typhoon particularly interesting or rich ground for you to work on?
Well, again, oh, sorry, this was my second story. I was a journalist during Typhoon Yolanda, and it was a Category 5 typhoon, and it struck central Philippines. I was actually supposed to be on a C-130 going to Ground Zero, which was the city of Tacloban, but a fight with my mother led to me not going. That said, we were still doing sort of relief ops at my office where we would get video streams of survivors, and they're talking in their regional language, and they're trying to tell their family members that they're okay, but they have no way of talking to them because the communication lines were down and like lost their cell phones, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then those couple of weeks lead after the typhoon, like I think I would go home and I would cry a little because it was such a big thing, and it really hit me hard when I also saw that there were tanks driving past my office because they were on their way down south to help with the relief efforts. And at the same time, I was also editing and writing news stories about people online who were not in the Philippines at the time, and they would be saying awful things like, "You all deserve that. God is angry at you," shit like that. And it really had a big impact on me because even though I was telling a lot of stories on different angles about the storm, I also felt like I wasn't really doing much. Like I sent a food package to a friend in Samar, and I have no idea to this day if she ever got it.
Mm-hmm.
So that there we go.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, cool. I'm writing notes, so that's why I'm kind of quiet over here.
Actually, that leads me to, I know we were talking about, I told you one of the topics I could talk about was writing activist science fiction and fantasy.
Absolutely.
So I was making notes on this last night, and I realized that there are two emotions that you can come from when you want to write a story that talks about contemporary issues.
Mhm.
One emotion is anger, and another is compassion. And
Yeah.
in the case of this story I wrote about a natural disaster, and probably even the stories that will be about this COVID pandemic after this,
Mm-hmm.
if I think the emotion that you write from is compassion, because it's there's no use getting angry at a storm or a plague or volcano eruption, things like that. What
Mm.
makes you angry is probably government response to the disaster, or like those people commenting that you deserve that and things like that. It's the human response to the event that incites anger. On the
Yeah.
other hand, let me just pull up my notes here. Compassion, though, the story should be about how the affected people or community tried to deal or heal from the disaster or the illness. And for me, the best kinds of stories that write from a place of compassion are not about outsiders trying to save these people. And maybe the story shouldn't even be about saving, because your definition of saving someone might be different from their definition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess the way to do it would be like kind of like a journalist, empathy, but at a distance. You're reporting on them and like shining a light on their plight without positioning yourself or a character as champion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas if you write from a place of anger, it should be, well, what makes you angry? Injustice, unfairness. And you like try to figure out what kind of injustice have you experienced. Do you see that injustice applied to other people in your life, acquaintances, maybe strangers that you see on the news? Can you connect that injustice to a bigger societal issue?
Mm-hmm.
And like, if you want the story to pack the punch that you want it to have, you have to experience it for yourself. And I say that as a key because there are a lot of people who get angry about injustice they see in the world, but then they haven't experienced it themselves, or they don't know anyone who has.
Yeah.
And I only say this because it's possible that the story you're writing will take away some of the spotlight from the people who have actually experienced it and whose voices need to be heard.
Right.
So one way to diagnose it is, well, you look beyond yourself, because activism isn't just for your benefit, it's for the benefit of others, of like a wider group of people, maybe society as a whole. And you might even see how this injustice links up to other injustices, like the whole thing about the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And other an important note is that injustice is always about punching up toward an authority or establishment that's greater than you, because punching down makes you a bully.
Yeah.
Also, if you feel that you really want to write about an injustice that you yourself haven't experienced, you might need to sit with yourself and explore why this issue elicits such strong emotions in you, because maybe the answer to like alleviating those emotions isn't through writing. It might be through like helping other people on
Yeah.
a grassroots level. And if the injustice happened to a family member or close friend, it still might not be your story to tell, even if it hurt you tangentially. The way I see it, your story here very likely lies in your reaction to someone you care about being affected by an injustice and your struggles in supporting them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are all really good points. I feel like we have a lot of people here. Would any of you like to respond to some of those issues? It's okay, really.
Oh, sorry.
This
Heavy
is not,
topic.
you guys are not the audience for an interview exclusively, just so you know. People who've been on Dive a lot know that, but I don't know if everybody knows that.
I think it's a really interesting viewpoint, because a lot of science fiction is sort of written with this sort of heroism and saviorism in mind. And I don't know that I've seen enough that isn't.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm actually, no offense if anyone's writing like a savior hero narrative here. I'm just getting tired of a lot of, I need to save this, I need to save that. And maybe you don't even have a direct connection to whatever it is you're trying to save. Sorry, but that is super colonialist.
Mhm.
It's I don't know, it's the whole white man's burden kind of complex. And this is a frustration I have with my own society, because too often we vote for the wrong people in the elections because we see those people as the key to alleviating our own suffering, when we need to realize that we are the only people who can save ourselves. Unfortunately, over here in the Philippines, it's reinforced through our media that someone will step in to save you.
Mhm.
We need to, I think, we need to empower each other to be able to raise ourselves up.
Mhm.
Fighting a narrative that only I can fix it. We
Yeah.
can fix it.
Yeah, that's not I don't know. Where I come from, we're a collectivist society, and we have to rely on each other. Even our cultural values place a lot of emphasis on helping each other out and being hospitable and things like that.
Mhm. So I think that's a really interesting point. And I think that the story that we are talking about conveys that in a really interesting way. I like your choice to put the main perspective as kind of an observer and somebody who can maybe do one or two things to support the efforts of the Diwata who is doing the relief effort. But in fact, this protagonist is doing something very different from what you usually see. This is not somebody who's like wading in with both hands and trying to, deliver relief, food, etc. on their own, but to observe and maybe to bring an awareness of what's happening, like the suffering that's happening and what kind of aid is being delivered to a potential wider audience, which also includes the reader. So I think that's really cool. It's got this sort of meta vibe to it.
Well, it might also come from my perspective that I came from journalism. So in my eyes, the ordinary on the ground journalist is also a hero, because they are risking their lives to bring you a story. And you could be angry at that story, you could be angry at the journalist, but the fact of the matter is they did the work and they exposed themselves for no hazard pay just to bring you the story.
Yeah.
And that in itself makes them heroic, I think, because they're also not emphasizing their own role most good journalists anyway, they're not emphasizing their own role in the story.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you about a particular piece of the story.
Sure.
One of the, there's so much that's interesting, but one of the ones that just sort of popped into my head was the part where the Diwata is bringing a cross to somebody who needs it,
Yes.
but doesn't bother to explain why she's carrying it to the journalist until quite late in the game. Can you tell it? Can you like tell the people who are here what happens a little bit in that sequence, and then give us your thoughts on it?
Okay, so for those who haven't read the story, there's a sequence where the journalist notices that there's a cross in the boat that the Diwata is carrying, and it's surprising to her because Diwata are, well, of course, they're not Catholic, which is majority of the religion here, and what is this pagan mountain goddess doing with a cross, right? And then what happens here is that they take the cross and they go on shore, and yes, there's this town, this little fishing town that was devastated by the storm, but they go right past the town, and a lot of people are noticeably scared of them, and they go into a forest when there's a little hut, and there is this girl, this college student, who's caring for her brother who like broke his legs during the storm. And it turns out that while trying to escape the storm, their mother was crushed under a tree, and they had no money to arrange her burial in the proper cemetery. So it turns out that Diwata and her husband helped bury that mother, and they had gone across the region to look for a wood carver who would make them that cross, and then the cross would be the marker for her grave. And then at the end of that sequence, they all stand there and be quiet for a bit to pay their respects.
Yeah.
So I wanted to make a statement there. Maybe it's not obvious to like, other people who haven't researched Philippine history, but when the Spanish came here and brought Catholicism, they couldn't quite win the people over. They couldn't purge the religion from the inhabitants of the Philippines. So what they did was they would take different elements of the local religions and incorporate them into Catholicism. So when you come here to the Philippines, you'll be kind of surprised at the Catholicism on display because a lot of it is still pretty pagan. Like for example, you go to a church in Quiapo, there are all these vendors selling next to it fortune telling services, like rosaries that have been blessed, and then agimat, which is kind of like a magical ward. So Catholicism here has been super mixed up in our pagan traditions. I give an example of, I realized recently, because the gods of the Tagalog pantheon, I'm a Tagalog, they don't teach that to us in school. I only found out about them when I graduated from college. And when I was doing further research, I realized that because we here in the Philippines have different kinds of witchcraft and different words for witches. Some of the names of the underworld gods were turned into names for witches and demons.
Yeah.
So, hi.
Hello.
Sorry, I'm having to join you late. When I was a graduate student in ethnomusicology, we studied a lot of syncretic traditions, like from Yoruba-based religions. One of my professors was Brazilian, and we studied candomblé, which is the same parallel to Santeria and Voodoo and all that, where Catholic saints were mapped onto Yoruba gods and goddesses, and in a syncretic tradition.
It's actually pretty cool to me how like different cultures around the world somehow managed to mold Catholicism in our own way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because there's a sort of a blended feeling that comes out of it. Not as though, yeah, I mean, like, for example, in the story, the Diwata seems very chill with Catholicism, right? Not just, not, it wasn't, it's not just as though, well, she knows that this is something that's valued by these people, and therefore she's deliberately doing something that, you know, is somehow, you never get the sense that this is somehow wrong to her, but that this was very natural, that she would do this for this person who needed it to be done in this particular way. But clearly she'd also gone to a great deal of trouble in order to do that, right? Gone and found the wood carver and you know, gone through the process of finding this. So anyway, I just thought it was a really, really interesting part of the story. Yeah. There are some interesting thoughts happening in the chat bar, but I want to make sure that we're sticking with where Vida wants to go with this. So let's see. Cool. I wanted to get your thoughts on something that you mentioned to me yesterday, which was the question of deploying world building seamlessly.
Okay, yeah. It came to my attention because I have a friend here, hi Cupcake, who told me that he likes the way that I integrate narrative elements into my prose. So I made some notes about this. Hi Cake. So the way I integrate those elements in my own prose is it kind of follows still some journalistic elements. For example, in journalism, your first sentence, your lead sentence, should answer the 5 W's and the 1 H. So who, what, when, where, and how. Although in the case of fiction, I've found that it is better for you and your reader if you hold back on the why for much later. Like, I'll get into this later, but for me, I like the reader to think of the story as a puzzle that they're assembling over time, and that and it's a puzzle that they'll enjoy assembling. So this gets really technical, but for example, in your first sentence in your story, you can deploy like 2 to 3 of the 5 W's, and then spend the rest of the paragraph answering the remaining questions except the why, because the why may be answered by the succeeding paragraphs or the rest of the story. And every sentence of yours should yield a piece of information, like that the reader can put together a puzzle. And that and like it could be different things like the magic system or the technology and how it works, what the mood of the story is, the characters and the relationships with each other and their goals, or the conflict of the story. Try not to yield to the temptation to introduce all the elements at once, because that'll turn into an info dump. And because my ideal reader is a smart reader who will look things up when they need to, you gotta trust that they will put the puzzle together and enjoy the process. And you also need to, you as the writer also need to enjoy the process to be able to deploy the elements slowly. And this happens when you've got a discovery mindset when it comes to writing. Essentially, you're a journalist investigating the story and simply transcribing it as it happens. So like some examples of elements that I just drop in casually in like maybe a sentence or two are like superstitions, religious beliefs, clothing, the languages the characters speak, the use names they call each other, reputations, body language, things like that. Then you make sure also to utilize the 5 senses and any possible 6 senses granted by the magic system or the technology when you're describing things. It also helps to be specific when you're describing things. Instead of shoes, you say sandals, boots, sneakers, or what have you. Instead of trees, you say acacia, coconut, banyan, things like that. Specific words suggest their context. For example, sandal suggests that the character is in a desert or a beach because that's the appropriate footwear. Acacia tree suggests that the character is in a tropical climate or setting. And if you're worried that the reader still can't figure it out from a specific word, you need to be able to leave enough context clues in the rest of the paragraph so that they can get it.
Words are very, very, like single words like sandals are very powerful in this kind of context. They bring a whole, a word can bring a whole raft of different kinds of contextual pieces along with it. And sometimes those pieces are not the correct pieces that you want. So I don't know, it's partly the juxtaposition of different words, but it's also, you know, making sure that you're not picking a word that has a bunch of outside stuff coming in with it.
Yeah, that's why unlike some other people, I keep my Wi-Fi on when I write because I want to make sure that this is the correct word I'm using, and I probably will forget about it later. Of course, this means that I have probably spent an hour in a research dive and I didn't do any actual writing at all. But the story is all the better for it when I get back to it later because I have done the research. Actually, recently, I was going through a story that I'm writing, and then I wanted to make sure that I had the building material right. And maybe that's a crazy way to think, but I wanted to make sure I was using the right building material for this desert climate. I didn't want them to be stuck in a building that actually keeps the heat in instead of keeping it out. So I researched it, the building material I used, and I found that I had actually researched it before and I didn't need to dive again. So, okay, cool. No more work for me.
Well, I'm sure your second dive was more quick than your first.
Yeah.
What was the material, by the way?
I think I looked into adobe, sandstone, and limestone, particularly white sandstone.
Cool. So obviously, part of your process is to keep your Wi-Fi available in case you need to take a little side trip into the realms of, of whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah.
Did you have any side trips worthy of note when you were writing this story that we're talking about today?
I had to research a bunch of different towns that were hit by the typhoon. So Estancia in the story is in Iloilo is very near one of the, what do you call this? One of the little fishing capitals in the Visayas. I cannot remember, but I think they called it like a little Alaska. Don't quote me on that because the research was a while back. I also remembered that the popular song at the time was Happy by Pharrell Williams, so that made it into the story too.
Yeah.
And I remembered seeing all these videos of, I don't know, Filipinos are weird because when you look in the news and we just had a natural disaster, we're still smiling at the camera, like, what is up with that? So that also made it into the story because, well, you know, societal quirks. What else is there? I had to research on if any of the resorts in Palawan, which is the tourist destination that also got hit. What was happening there? Like, were they badly affected? Did they have any electricity at the time?
Mhm.
And of course, I also looked into mythological creatures, but from the Visayas region. And just some context, I live in Luzon, and that's the mainland. The Visayas is a bunch of regions broken up into little islands, and each one has their own language and their own mythology. And that was a very deep dive for me.
Wow. Yeah. Because of course that would be the case.
Yeah.
So just to make a note here, since I do linguistics, one of the general principles that I find is really useful to keep in mind is that the longer human beings have been in a particular area, the more likely it is that you will find lots and lots and lots of language variants.
Oh, that's cool.
So yeah, and it really it's a general principle that I find very useful because colonialism obviously sweeps through with usually a particular language and tries to sort of regularize or like decide on the official language for everybody. In part because they haven't been there for that long, right? But like dialects in the Eastern United States versus the Western United States, there are more in the East than there are in the West, because even the colonists have been there longer, right? But so when you have an area that's geographically very distinct, right? There's a possibility that you will have groups of people who will not communicate with one another a lot over hundreds of years. And so what ends up happening is this huge diversification.
Absolutely. Weirdly enough, the Spanish allowed the country to keep its languages. So for a while, Spanish was one of our main languages, but also the languages we were born with. And then eventually during the American period, we added English. So when you go to the Philippines, I mean, don't go to Manila because most of us are just bilingual over here. But if you go to the regions, you will meet people who know 3, 4, 5 languages from birth, especially the Muslim communities, because they also need to learn Arabic.
Yeah.
And in total, we have 128 languages the last time I researched that.
Wow.
Wow. When I went to Nepal, I was talking with the Sherpas and they said there was like 100 languages in Nepal. And I said, what? It was just like mind blowing. And the Sherpas, we knew like a dozen of them. It's like, huh.
Yeah, it's just something you grew up with, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It has to do, well, I mean, there's a lot of different factors, but one of the factors is, how useful are these different languages to you in your day-to-day life? And the more useful they are to you and the more culturally accepted it is for people to be multilingual, then the more likely that people are going to know lots and lots of languages.
Yeah.
I think it's a real shame that America is so inimical to multilingualism on all kinds of levels. But anyway, that's cool. And thanks for the small Nepal tidbit there, Paul. Let's see what else. That was very cool. So I think that we spoke about this before, but I think it might be worth revisiting it to some extent.
All right.
You were talking about researching the local mythologies of the regions that you were looking at.
Yeah.
What form do you find the information in when you're researching, typically?
Well, I mean, if you mean like, how do I find them? There's this great website called Aswang Project that is attempting to become an encyclopedia of all of the mythological, not just the mythological creatures, but like the deities of the different pantheons in the Philippines. And from time to time, I follow them on Instagram too. They take pictures of resource books that they've found that are that would be super valuable to writers and to artists. Now, the thing is, I wish I found more in books, and I have been growing a collection for half a decade now. The thing is, the Philippines is kind of weird like this because I used to work in a publishing house, so I know for a fact that a decent print run here is 500 copies, and there's no guarantee that you're going to get a reprint. A bestseller is 1,000 copies and above, probably. Yes, that is a very good resource there in the chat. So there are a lot of books printed in the past that are like mythology lovers are kind of fighting each other over nowadays just to try and get a copy, because a lot of them are not digitized either, and they go for super expensive on Amazon. And if you're lucky, you can find them in a secondhand bookstore. And many of the secondhand bookstores here have also moved their business online, but then they have a model where first come, first serve. First one to comment mine, it'll be yours. So
yeah,
I would say that the resources are also pretty limited. You could go to a library, but I do not see anyone going anywhere anytime soon. And so a lot of us also rely on this is terrible, but the Xerox copies that we had to make when we were college students.
yeah.
Yeah. At one time I went to a market and an online market, and I was looking for this seminal work on mythology in the Philippines. And there was this girl who was willing to sell to me her Xerox copies of the books. And I was already getting desperate. I nearly bought them until someone pointed out to me that, oh, they're being sold over here. Like, oh, I didn't even know that. And then, so I quickly grabbed them, even though it cost me like half of the salary for that week, because I didn't know when else I was going to get them. And also those particular books, the Maximo Ramos series of books, they're not going to reprint many of those books.
Mm-hmm. So you found the books in the end? Or you
Yeah,
found...
I did.
Okay.
I did. But I only found like part of the collection. And I feel really stupid because the other part of the collection was in that bookstore when I was buying the other books. And when I looked at them a couple of years later, because I didn't realize those other books were also valuable in mythology because they seemed like memoirs.
Mm-hmm.
The bookstore wasn't selling them anymore. So the guy from Aswang Project told me that he was willing to sell me some copies. They were much more expensive, but I really wanted them, so I bought them.
Mm. So eventually you were able to get the whole collection.
Yeah.
Wow. Nicely done. That's cool though. I'm intrigued by that idea that they would look like memoirs.
Yeah. If you look them up, there's one called Boyhood in Monsoon Country, and then Patricia of the Green Hills. And I'm like, this does not look like a reference book. But then my other friends were like, no, actually, there are cultural tidbits that can be found in both books. And I was like, oh my God, I feel so stupid.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to know at the time, right?
Yeah.
So we're getting relatively close to 5 p.m. So I think what I'll do at this point is I'll open up to everybody else who's here. I don't even know how many people are here. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. if you would like to ask Vida questions at this point, please feel free.
Hello, friends.
Hi, Vida.
Hey, Jeremy.
So one of the things that you kind of touched on earlier that I think is interesting, and I'd like to hear more of your thoughts about, if you have them, is this idea of Catholicism as it sweeps through the world, kind of integrating the indigenous religions that it encounters with itself. And the people who then live under that Catholicism are aware of this and totally okay with it. That's something that I also observed when I was living in China. But it's not something that I observe in fantastical religions very frequently. Like when people world build out a religion, there seems to be a very clear delineation between, like, this is the invasive religion, this is the indigenous religion. You think about, like, in Game of Thrones as sort of an example everybody knows about, there's the Church of the Seven, which is very distinct from the old gods, and there are people who are participants in both, but they're very distinct things. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on how people who are world building can think through how do they create that kind of realistic integration of religions in a way that creates story spaces that we maybe don't see very often.
Okay, so I'll give you a real world example. Over here in the Philippines, a lot of us worship the Santo Niño, and that's basically another way for saying the baby Jesus. And if you Google Santo Niño, there are some really creepy statues of this minuscule human in huge, like, elaborate robes and a crown. And you know what? I discovered in recent years that the Santo Niño is actually a cult from the Middle Ages. And somehow it became a hit here. It might also be because when Magellan came to the Philippines, was it Magellan? I think so, yes. He and his crew, they left a Santo Niño with a Queen of Cebu because they managed to convert her and her husband. And then a couple decades later, when the second batch of explorers arrived, they found the Santo Niño in an abandoned hut, and they took it as a sign that they should spread Catholicism across the islands. And also I guess it took to the cultural consciousness because we really value children and youth here. So I would say that you could probably dig up any obscure religious cult. It doesn't have to be a cult, but like any minor religion, and then you see, for example, what's your term for it? The pervasive religion? The
Syncretic religion, maybe?
Yeah.
Like the invading religion,
Yes.
Indigenous religion or something.
Okay, so you take the invading religion and then you give the people spreading it a mindset of, okay, it's instead of eradicating this religion, why don't we try to, number one, try to turn the people against their own religion by, for example, you take the names of their gods and turn them into demons. That's one way to do it. Or you take a cult of theirs and mold it with one of their gods, so that they're still kind of worshiping their god, but they're also kind of worshiping the god of the invading religion. I saw an example recently. There was in Pampanga, in Luzon, there was a god, Sinukuan. It's actually a diwata now. Okay, can you correct me if I'm wrong about this? But then there was yes, Sinukuan was a god who was male in the original religion. But then the Spanish thought that they could undermine Sinukuan by turning him female. This backfired because before colonization, the Philippines elevated women to the same status as men. So Sinukuan now can be both male and female. And honestly, I am trying to cook up a story where it's a statement on transgenderism and them having to use any bathroom they want, because that was a big issue here last year when someone tried to use a bathroom and they got jailed for it. So yeah, I hope that helped a bit.
Yeah, that's great. I really like the idea of using a cult that maps sort of onto an indigenous thing, and then creating kind of a almost a mimetic power play around that.
Yeah, because I noticed that when people write about colonizers in fantasy these days, it's always about destroy, destroy, destroy. But actually, it's you can, again, this is personally terrible, but you can also try to integrate these people with you by turning their cultural mores on their heads and injecting your own.
Yeah, and like as you said, that's kind of how the history played out in the real world.
Interesting.
Anyone else have other questions?
No, I'm good.
What?
Never mind.
Well, it looks like everybody's got a lot to think about.
This is a very thinky episode.
Yeah. So why don't we say thank you, Vida, for coming. I really, really appreciate you making the time in your busy and unpredictable work schedule to reach out across oceans in this weird time and talk to us about your work. It's just delightful. And I really can't wait to see this story that's coming out in Strange Horizons. That's going to be really cool.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on. Because
I've
just been worrying about, the daily reality, and it's just so nice to talk about writing with like-minded people.
Well, I love it too, and it's wonderful to have you on. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to stop the YouTube stream, but we can continue to talk afterwards.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.